Hello, everyone. Wish you all a very good morning. And yes, I think there are very few attendees because maybe or because of Diwali. So today the session is going to be till 10 o'clock because there's no session on Thursday because on Thursday we have Diwali on 4th of November. So that is the reason why everything section E and section F both will be covered today itself. So we'll start with section E, where we'll focus mainly on capital budgeting techniques, and then we'll move on to professional ethics. So I'll be just sharing my screen with all of you. So I hope it is visible and also my voice is pretty audible to all of you. Can anyone just confirm once before proceeding? Okay, okay. Yeah, just a moment. Okay. So in capital budgeting techniques, we are going to learn each of these and very important. I would say most of the questions which come on capital budgeting techniques are from discounted payback period. Then it comes from NPV and IRR. And in case of NPV IRR, I would say if they want to put difficult sums, they'll give you in combination. So in one sum, they will ask you about NPV calculation as well as IRR calculation, or else they'll add discounted payback period. Only payback period, accounting rate of return, all these things might be there, might not be there. So that is the order of importance. So this is a summary. Before that, calculating cash flows for the year. So here we add back depreciation. People ask me what is the easiest method. So the first method I would say is the best to go for, because there are less chances of errors. So for taking cash flows for our capital budgeting techniques, what we do is that we do a normal calculation first. We calculate it normally, from sales, we subtract our depreciation, interest, taxes. Now here you can see that, we are going to from EBITDA subtract your non-cash expenditure. We are going to take the tax benefit and then we are going to again add back that depreciation. Because ideally, if you see, we are just taking the tax benefit, but in reality, there is no cash outflow. So first we land on the actual cash inflow from that particular activity, which is there, or the cash outflow, that is our initial investment, what we do. The second method also you can do it, but I suggest you go for the first one. So from sales, you subtract your cost, your interest, cash flows before taxes, and then you again add back the tax shield instead of adding the entire depreciation amount, which is there. Exam tip, look out for initial cash outflow, cash flow from operations after tax. And remember to adjust for depreciation tax shield. Tax shield if you're going for the second method, and only depreciation if you're going for the first method. Terminal cash inflows. So in case, in between, if you choose to dispose an asset or, you are going to receive, you're going to recover the working capital. So whatever cash inflow is there, either between the project or at the end of the project, you need to consider that. See, in the initial investment, someone asked what things are included. So in the initial investment, we include our main purchase price or the main investment you make in the construction, along with the ancillary, expenditure which is there. So, the ones which are normally used to take forward that project, which are related to it directly, all those expenditures you are going to add in order to get the initial cash investment. So anything related to it, you are going to add it. Most of all, the direct cost which is there, or the one cost which is allocated for in that initial investment. So let's say I have 3 construction projects and they are not mutually exclusive. So for project 1, how much of bill or rent is being allocated to it, that must be considered in that project's initial investment. So we come on to a first method, that is your payback period. Now here the drawback is that it doesn't consider time value of money. So you must all have done this method once in the past initial lectures. So you must have come across that we directly add the cash inflows, we accumulate them, but we don't do it, apply present value factor to it. You definitely will get $100 in the coming 3-4 years, but the value of $100 which is there today will not be the same the next year, and again it will decrease in the following year. So though that factor which is there, it needs to be considered. That is why we have discounted payback. But first we'll understand this and then we'll go to that. Payback period is the length of time it takes for the initial cash outlay for the investment to be recovered in cash. If the cash flow is same each year, these 2 points are very important, then it equals the initial investment divided by the annual cash net cash inflow. So you're going to simply apply the formula. If cash flow is uneven, start with initial investment. So let's say if you have initially invested $1 lakh, and then subtract each year's cash inflow until the entire investment has been recovered. Now here they have given a question. So here first we have our normal payback period, then we have our discounted payback period. So assume an investment of $300 results in a return of $100 each year. So in 3 years, everything is going to get recovered. Simple maths, no need of calculation. In the second part, what they have done, for every cash inflow which is there, not the initial investment. The initial investment, you are doing it today. So the rate of $1, your factor is also, present value factor is also 1. But inflows, what happens is that when you invest today, you're going to start getting returns from the upcoming period. So at that point of time, you need to start applying a present value factor. And from where will you get this? So in the exam, they already give you present value table. So you need not break your head on learning on this. So they have listed down the factors, simply multiplied them and landed on present value of cash flows. They're going to accumulate it. And the point where they're able to recover $300. So where are they able to recover? If you see, the recovery is happening between the 3rd and the 4th year. Something nearing the 4th year. So how are you going to calculate discounted payback period? It is nothing but your number of years, your initial year. So your initial year is 3 and 4 means it's 3 years, plus the amount which you wanted to recover minus the amount which is recovered in the 3rd year upon the amount which will be recovered by 4th year minus the one recovered in the previous year. You land on 3.75. It is approx 3 years, 9 months. Now in exam, it is quite easily estimatable, so nothing to worry about. So like, how did they convert 3.75 into 9 months? So pretty much, it is much easier. You can do it directly. So if they in the exam ask you which is the most, advantageous method, you know which one to go for in both of these. Then we have our accounting rate of return, rarely asked. So compared to other methods, but again, you have this in your curriculum. Now here what they do, again, they don't consider time value of money, but another disadvantage is that they also don't consider your cash flows. Accounting rate of return is a method that computes an approximate rate of return which ignores the time value of money and does not consider actual cash flows. This is calculated by taking accounting income divided by the investment. So they have already given the formula here. Simple formula which means for return on investment, but again not much fruitful when you are making capital budgeting decisions. Investment usually refers to the initial investment, of course, the initial amount which you put into it. But occasionally the exam requires the use of average book value of the investment each year. What does it mean when I say average book value? Your investment balance at the beginning in that particular project, plus you're in, adding the investment balance in that project in the year end upon 2. In the first year, the average book value is the initial investment reduced by 1/2 year of depreciation. So they have mentioned it here in the example as well. If an asset cost $1,000 has a 5-year life, no salvage value, and straight line method is used, then the average book value in the first year is the 1,000 minus, they have calculated their depreciation here. 1,000 into 1 by 5, that is the number of years. It is SLM, so the division will be the same throughout the year. Into half is equal to $1,000 minus $100. Why half? Because they're taking average book value is equal to $900. What are the limitations of this method? So advantage is obviously it is simple. You simply calculate return on investment. It makes no adjustment for project risk. The results are affected by depreciation method. See, above in the example, they have used SLM. What if they use double declining method or sum of your digits method? That makes a difference. Then accounting the rate of return makes no adjustment for the time value of money. Very important, IRR, and after that NPV. The next part, which is the ranking investment project, the next module, which is there, a lot of questions will come from that also. Again, there you have to use a mix of both these methods. The best part of IRR again is that you use cash flow, you use time value of money, and it is not simple, but I would say that it is like if you keep on practicing, it definitely becomes simple. So IRR is the discount at which the NPV is 0. It is where the rate of interest equates present value of cash inflow is equal to your present value of cash outflows. It can be used to compare alternative investment and is known as a time adjusted rate of return from an investment. You are using time value of money factor here, right? So how are you going to calculate that? So basically you will have an initial investment at the beginning, how much you invested upon what was your after tax net cash inflow, and then you're going to land up on a number. Now you're going to search for it with the number of years for which the inflows are going to be received, and you're going to land up on the, so like, where do you get 3.0 in your present value table? In the 5 years column, for which percentile do you get? You get it for 20%. That is your IRR. If the firm has sufficient funds and undertake all projects, if they are mutually exclusive, then you need to land up on the best part. And how do you come on to it? You also need to use your NPV method. Again, your internal rate of return should be greater than the minimum rate which is acceptable. So minimum, if I accept that the return can be 8%, at least my IRR should be greater than 8%. So let's say it can be 10, it can be 12%. Otherwise, there's no point in investing if it is less than the hurdle rate, which my organization has decided. It should be always more than that. So this is something which can come for your MCQ. Advantages and disadvantages can also come in essay type question. So there's a chance that you might get a sum on IRR, and they might ask you what are the advantages and limitations in essays. So make sure that you do that. So we have in essays sub questions. So they might give you a question on IRR in the first, they might tell you to solve it in the second, they might tell you to tell the advantages and limitations, and the third, they might give you even more something different. So this is a very good concept where they can give breakup and put on sub questions. NPV, net present value, is the excess present value of cash inflow over cash out. So pretty easy to understand. And I would rather say this is easy to calculate. If you know how to calculate the method of, the basic method, the skeleton of discounted payback period, I don't think NPV should be a problem for anyone. The simple calculation is how much present value of cash inflow you're receiving over cash outflow. So how much more you're achieving than the break even by applying the present value factors to both of them. We'll move on to the sum first, and then we'll come back to the part which is there. So here in the NPV, you can see that just for an example, I've opened it. In the NPV, you can see that there's a cash inflow. They have applied the present value factor and they have come on to present value. The cash outflow, because it's the initial investment and your present value factor today, if you invest today, will be 1. That is 900, and then you're going to land up on your NPV. Now, if the NPV is greater than $1 or greater than 0, you should go forward for that project. If it is equal to 0, you may go forward with that project, but if it is less, if it is a negative. So let's say if cash inflow was 900 and cash outflow was 948, then don't go ahead with that project. Now, what are the advantages of NPV again? Present results in dollars, which are easily understood because you are subtracting, then adjust for time value of money, your cash inflows which you're going to receive in the future. Consider the total profitability of the project, because for every cash inflow you're going to calculate it. Provide a straightforward method of controlling for the risk of completing project. Higher risk cash flow can be discounted at a higher interest rate. Provides a direct estimate of the change in shareholder wealth resulting from undertaking a project. Now, what are the limitations? It may not be considered as simple or intuitive as some other methods. Does not take into account the management flexibility with respect to the project, as the management may be able to adjust the amount invested after the first year or two depending on actual returns. So see, what they are trying to say in this point is that only you do the initial investment and everything is over. It doesn't happen that way for any projects, honestly. You are going to invest later on also, maybe some working capital or some or the other thing. You're going to invest in the upcoming year. So things are going to change. So it's not just initial investment, but there is going to be investment further also for that project as it keeps growing and progressing. There are multiple factors attached to it. Also, the project might have a positive NPV and a better IRR more than the hurdle rate, but there might be other subjective factors due to which you may consider that this investment is not good to go forward with. So these are just technical aspects. There are other things also which you have to consider before selecting a area for investing. Relationship between NPV and IRR. So as I mentioned, if NPV is greater than 0, it means your IRR is greater than your minimum acceptable and more than hurdle rate except the project. If NPV is equal to 0, IRR is equal to your hurdle rate, again accept the project. But if it is less than 0, it means your IRR is very much less than your acceptable rate, reject the project. This relationship is important for your MCQs. Profitability index. Present value future net cash inflows, which you have calculated above in the table when you accumulate it upon your initial investment into 100. So this is how you get your profitability index. Now they have mentioned this concept of capital rationing. What is capital rationing? Most of them have limited funds. So if there are 3 options in front of me, I might have to choose one and reject others. So in that case, I'm going to calculate profitability index also of every project. I want to understand which project to go for and which project to not go for. Such projects are called mutually exclusive. And the situation is often described as capital rationing. You will have some on capital rationing also for your MCQs. Now we'll move on to ranking investment project. See, this chapter is such that you need a lot of practice. Only practice will make you a master in this chapter which is there. And also, whichever exam you appear for, whichever professional qualification, this chapter is never going to leave your back. So ensure that you do it very well now only. And sums do come from this chapter very nicely the way I have told you. So don't skip any, not even a single concept from this particular section. Capital rationing, as I mentioned, limited funds need to prioritize investment. So on what criteria are you going to prioritize? We did see what is about profitability index. Then you have your NPV IRR calculation previously, which we use for profitability index, the values which are there. So the accumulation of all the cash inflows, discounted cash inflows and so on. So let us understand from this sum. RK Manufacturing, in evaluating 3 capital investments, project A, B, and C, it has imposed a capital rationing limit of $10,000. Its desired rate of return is 10%. So a total investment which they have given for each of these projects is $10,000, $5,000, and $5,000. Cash inflow in the year 1 and cash inflow in the year 2. And total present value of net cash inflows. So they have applied the factor to each of these cash inflow in year 1 and year 2, and they have come on to an answer. Now we can see in the first part that the cash inflow is much higher than your initial investment. Same goes for the rest of the 2. But again, if you add B and C, okay, so totally if you can invest only 10,000, which they have, the limit is $10,000. But the cash the present value of cash inflows, which is the combined of B and C, is more than project A. So you should be wise enough to invest in project B and C together than just investing in project A. They have calculated here exactly how they landed on $21,400 for project B and then for project C. Although project B and C individually have lower NPVs than project A, they collectively have the higher NPV. On this basis, it would seem logical to select projects B and C. Choosing investment projects solely on the basis of NPV is not necessarily the best method. So you need to also use other factors I mentioned. One of it is profitability index. So they have used the same values and calculated the PI and ranked the investment. Cash inflow for year 1, year 2. Then they have calculated your total present value. Then total present value of future net cash inflow at 10%. And then they have landed upon the profitability index. So how have they calculated profitability index? Present value of future net cash inflow upon your initial investment at 10%. And then they have got 3.14, 4.21, and 3.39. So obviously the first one will be the highest number, that is your project B. Then you have a project C, and then at the end you have your project A. And because your total limit is $10,000, you can invest in B and C together. So go for it. So again, by using this method also, we'll end up on our same answer only. The NPV method and the profitability index may result in the same except project decision, but the two techniques can rank alternative projects in different orders. Another general use of the profitability index is that projects with a PI greater than 1.0 are acceptable and projects with a PI below 1 should be rejected. NPV expresses net dollar contribution of a project. Profitability index provides only a measure of relative profitability. Simple to use but cannot be used when more than one resource is being rationed over multiple periods. But in case of NPV, it is more complex to calculate. Personally, I don't think so. Can be used with multiple resources over multiple periods. So yes, you can use it for multiple projects, for multiple resources, for multiple types. So what resource are you using in your initial investment? You can classify that and calculate your NPV. PI ranking using the cost of capital will not lead to the choice of optimal set of investment. Previously, comparison of NPV IRR was given. Now they have given NPV and PR. Except if NPV is positive, profitability index will be greater than 1. Reject if NPV is negative, then the PI will be less than 1. And if there are limited funds, so you have to select any one of these projects, and you have to select the project which has the highest NPV and highest rank according to profitability index. This is the same mutually exclusive project, so selecting any one of these. So what you need to understand. Analysis method often yield conflicting result because of project differences pertaining to size of cash flows. So, previously your cash inflow might be much greater, in the later years it might be less. So this differences do occur. And pattern of the net cash flows and length of useful life. So if it is a project where you're going to get all the returns very quickly in a lesser period of time, then it is less riskier. If it is something going afar for 10, 20 years, for the cash inflows totally to recover initial investment, then I think it is a very riskier project. Precludes means before a project, initial. Using the NPV method, projects with the best potential to add incremental dollar value to the tip form are typically chosen. Alternate ranking method, if you ask me, these can come for your theory MCQ. Again, very less chance because this section itself has a lesser percentage of weightage if you see. So they already have enough questions to give you on NPV, IRR, discounted payback period, profitability index at times if they want to rank which one to invest into. So very less chance, very less scope for these questions to come. Now again, they are complete theory. My suggestion is just before the exam, read them twice and I think you're good to go. Linear programming is an optimization technique that determines the maximum value of some equation subject to stated linear constraints. Now, if you apply it to NPV, the program can test all possible scenarios and find the option that results in the maximum NPV. So you will directly get your answer, which one to invest into, especially if it is a part of capital rationing. So you can select any one option. I think linear programming is a good technique to go for. It can be used to allocate limited resources to projects and even the result in the recommendation of fractional projects. So you can invest some of your amount in project A and some of your amount in project B. Now, what will be an optimal mix? That also linear programming will tell you. If fractional projects are not feasible, the results can be constrained to whole projects. However, linear programming uses complex programming models and is expensive to maintain. Furthermore, the results are only as good as the data, and it is problematic to attempt to forecast all opportunities that may arise. Internal capital markets are internal budget constraints on funding or on employee management time. By imposing such limit, managers or divisions are forced to set realistic priorities and cash flow forecast. Firms that face internal capital constraints must prioritize available capital projects in alignment with company strategy and available funds. Advantage of this is that it will help you in selecting the best and the right project, the right fit. Okay, so just give me a moment. Let us move on to sensitivity analysis now. All these methods which are there, again, I would say that practical things, they might ask you, but very less. Most of all, again, it is theory. So in sensitivity analysis, what we do is that we identify that what will be the outcome. So not just for capital budgeting, but overall, what is sensitivity analysis? That how sensitive your outcome is based on a particular input. So let's say if I increase a small variable in my input, how intensely will the output get affected? That is what sensitivity analysis will tell you. That is what is the definition of this method. Sensitivity analysis as it pertains to capital investment is a what-if technique evaluating how NPV, IRR, and other indicators of the profitability of a project change if the discount rate, labor, or material cost, sales, or some other factor varies from one case to another. The purpose is to assess how sensitive a profitability measure is to a change. What happens to NPV if the cash flows increase or decrease by 10% for each year of the project? What will happen to NPV if the discount rate increases from 8% to 10%? So here you're trying to identify how the output is going to get affected because of the change in the input. What would happen to the NPV if a major redesign of the project requiring additional capital investment is necessary in year 3 in order to address competitive new products? The quality of the sensitivity analysis can become a value adding feature of a project. If a project has been carefully planned to accommodate variances in discount rates, cash flows, etc., then management and investors will be encouraged to support it, knowing that it has been designed to accommodate potential challenges. Sensitivity analysis is also complemented by using real options, which provides flexibility to add on, speed up, slow down, and discontinue project early based on certain pre-planned thresholds, which should be met during the life of the project. So here they have given the question of exactly how things are going to be different. So project at A at 10% and project A at 12%. So previously the NPV was $747. Now it is $602. So just by increasing 2%, you can see that there is a difference. Then again below also at 10% it was $1383 and at 12% it is $1244. Now here they have calculated how the values have changed. So of course, first they have mentioned the dollar change and then they have mentioned how much percentile change is there in NPV. So project A, the NPV changes by 19%, project B is just 10%. So it means project A is more sensitive to changes than project B. Moving on to certainty equivalent. Certainty equivalent approach to selecting project attempts to separate the timing of cash flows from their risk. How to do that? First, we'll read the steps and then we'll move on to the definition. Project the expected cash flows of the investment. Okay. Identify the certainty equivalent factor or the percentage of the expected cash flows that are certain. See, you have calculated your cash inflows, but how much percentage of it are you sure to receive? Now, whatever you're certain of, multiply that with your present value factor and calculate your NPV. So that is a certain that this much of a cash inflow, discounted cash inflow you are going to receive. And on this basis, you can take your decision of whether you should go forward with that project or not. I would say this is a much of a conservative approach than the original NPV method. See, everything is same. It's just that they have applied certainty equivalent factor. How much percentage are they certain that, what is the probability that they will definitely receive this amount of cash inflow? So I did estimate $15,000, but I'm actually 90% only sure that, I will receive this amount, or 90% of the amount will actually be received, actual cash inflow. So I'm going to just apply that factor and again calculate it normally as I calculate NPV. Now this is much better to do because here you are being conservative. But again, if you ask me, because we are applying certainty equivalent factor, we are somehow reducing the risk to a greater extent. And when you reduce risk, your return also ultimately are not that higher. Capital asset pricing model. You will for sure get this method. In any exam you appear for any professional qualification, CAPM will always be there. So how do you calculate that? Required rate of return on an asset. So first, in the required rate of return, there's a guarantee that you're going to get risk-free rate. So we always take that separately. So we have a risk-free rate plus your beta will tell you how risky your project is. So that you're going to multiply by your return over and above your risk-free rate. So risk-free rate is something you're going to receive. But upon that, this is a risk premium. So because of the additional risk you take, how much return you're going to receive. That is the second part of this method. No, certainty equivalent is different. It's totally different. In certainty equivalent, you're just identifying that, out of these cash inflows, which I have identified, how much, what is the certainty that I will receive, how much certain amount is there, which I'll receive out of the prediction. So let's have predicted कि $15,000 मुझे मिलेगा in the next coming in the first year, the first cash inflow. But out of the $15,000, how much am I actually certain? Out of that whole prediction, how much I'm actually certain ki milega? Only 90% of $15,000 is a certain value. 10% is uncertain yet. So you will receive it when you're uncertain. That is the factor which you apply in certainty equivalent and calculate it similar to NPV. In case of sensitivity analysis, we are identifying a percentile exactly if I change something in the input. How much difference will be there, or how much, how intensely will the output change? So I just increased my rate of return by 2%, and how quickly, the final NPV has changed by 19% for project A, but for project B it only changed by 10%. Right? And in case of depreciation, so you're going to always take the actual cash flow which is there. So go according to cash flow method. Don't go according to accrual method. So the initial investment or the cash inflows which we are talking about in all these sums, consider it according to cash flow accounting and not according to accrual method. So here in CAPM model, we are going to take what is the risk, how risky a project is into your market portfolio return minus a risk-free return. What does your market portfolio return minus risk-free return imply? How much over and above return you're going to get than your risk-free rate of return because you choose to invest in the market into how much risk you are taking. So the second part of CAPM is the risk premium. So that is how you're going to identify. See, when I talk about ERM in case of a, what's the question? In case of a project. So here, in case of a project, how much normally, return you would receive? What is the additional return you would receive in the market according to the market price. And risk-free rate is how much you're anyways going to receive no matter what are the market movements. So in real estate, how much is the minimum base which I will surely receive? May my project go fail or may my project pass? ERM, or you can just say RM, that is also fine. How much of return you're normally going to get from the market at this point of time from that particular sector? Yes. Sensitivity analysis only determines sensitivity of change, and certainty equivalent considers confirm amount to be recovered. So this is your CAPM. Sums at least one sum in an entire exam will come on capital asset pricing model. Beta of the company is used as the beta for the project. In the event that a project is not a typical investment for a company, an average industry beta can be substituted. So, so if you're into construction, so what is the industry beta for construction? If in your finance sector, in your BFSI sector, what is the beta? So you're going to consider it industry wise. Comparing betas among similar companies in similar industries called the pure play approach. Once the project required rate of return is identified, NPV can be calculated. So the 10% or 12%. Expected cash flows are discounted using the required rate of return, and total NPV of cash flows is subtracted from total initial project investment. A zero or positive NPV means that the project can be accepted as well as it will preserve the required rate of return. If multiple projects are being evaluated, the one with higher beta is considered more risky. See, beta is nothing but it will tell you how risky or how quick the market movements are. Higher the risk, higher the return. Higher the beta, higher the return. Because here you can see that if the beta increases to 2, 3, 4, ultimately your overall risk premium is also going to increase. And risk premium is what? Yeah, beta is always given in the question. You need not calculate. And the risk premium is what? Something additionally you are earning because of the risk which you are taking. So if the beta is higher, you can see that the required rate of return on asset will also be higher, because more risk you require a higher rate of return. Simulations. So what is this? So in simulations, what you do is that you calculate how much is expected, what can be, what cannot be, and then you come upon which project is the best to invest into. Simulations allow testing of a capital investment project before it is accepted. Since actual future values of for cash flows and discount rates for investment projects are not known, hypothetical cash flow and discount rates are assumed and can be studied using a simulation model. So what can be approximated from it? All the values which are used for calculating your selecting the best project or a best investment. Again, simulation sums you don't have for your exam, you have theory. Use of specifically adjusted rates. Risky capital projects are less desirable than safe investments. So this again depends on what is your risk appetite. See, if you are a firm who is risk averse, then you will go for less riskier projects, but again your rate of return expected will be lesser. If you're a risk aggressive organization, then you will definitely expect a higher rate of return from the projects. So that is what is it about. However, so let's just first understand this concept. Under most circumstances, risky capital projects are less desirable than safe investment. Firms typically demand a higher rate of return for riskier projects or use conservative estimate for cash flows. Many firms use their company's cost of capital as the yardstick to discount the cash flow on all new investment. However, this may be problematic in situations where the risk associated with the project is greater or less than the average risk of the firm's existing business. So I hope this is clear to all of you. So see, there are multiple factors. So it is not necessary that only one simple thing or only one factor will affect, but there are multiple areas. So as they have mentioned, good low risk projects may be rejected and poor high risk projects may be accepted. What is systematic risk in CAPM? Systematic risk is the risk overall of the industry, of the economy as a whole. So let's say there's an inflation or deflation. So the factors which affect the overall macroeconomy. And when I say unsystematic risk, it is confined to your organization or to your sub-industry. So unsystematic risk is still under control. Systematic risk you can't control. Is it preferable to assess relative risky risks of projects on an individual basis and use a new rate specifically adjusted for the project risk? By doing this, every project has its opportunity cost of capital. See, if you select one project and if it, see, this mainly applies in case of mutually exclusive projects. The opportunity cost factor which is there, it will arise in case of mutually exclusive projects. So students, now they are just, it's just theory later on. So now we'll take a break for 10 minutes and then we'll return back on 8:40. We'll start with our professional ethics. Okay, so let us start with business ethics. So again, this part which is there, so you can see especially in the second and the third paragraph, a lot of information is given. Please mark this as important for your MCQs. The foundation of ethics comes from Greek philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, starting back in the 4th century BCE. But it was Aristotle who named the philosophy ethos, which in Greek, for the science of morals, this became ethics. So ethos and ethics. This particular sentence is important for your MCQs. Please mark it down. Then we have some information given about FCPA, which we will be discussing ahead. Now, business ethics. So it can be at various levels. First of all, at the firm level. So overall, what is the business? What are the ethical policies which the organization follows, and along with that, how are the ethical policies being followed, or what are the values which you carry as an individual? So what are the set of rules and principles you carry as an individual, as an employee, and what the organization expects? Now the goal is that both these things should be aligned in order for you all to achieve your mission and vision. That gap which is there, that creates a problem in any organization. From this section, in MCQs, you are asked few, so that is my personal experience, and most of all, ethics scenarios are being asked for essays. So from this particular section, I would say concentrate more on essays, because there's a very good scope to ask you questions on ethics scenario. Now, can ethics be learned? So when I say ethics be learned, so over the period of time since our childhood, we start gathering certain information, things get registered in our mind, and we develop values over the period. So the person you were 10 years ago, now you're totally different. And during this journey, you have gathered different, you have set certain boundaries, you have set certain practices, certain way of doing your task, following certain things. So let's say if you believe that, I am an integral person, I am a person who maintains integrity. So that is the value which you have gathered over the period of time. And that is what you will exhibit in your work and personal and social life. It is difficult to make wise ethical choices when we are not sure exactly what is the ethical problem in the solution, in the situation. Hence, accounting and finance professionals can always improve their ability to be ethical in two specific ways. Recognizing and anticipating when ethics will be challenged in a particular situation. Recognizing and describing exactly how ethics are being challenged in a particular situation. See, there's a chance that you will get essay from this. There's no confirmation. So पक्का ऐसा कुछ नहीं होता किसी भी professional exam में. It is after all up to IMA. They can twist the paper at any point of time. So if they want, they can put essays from everything from section A and MCQs from section F. Normally it is vice versa. So normally there is at least one question, essay question from this particular part, but again, it is a professional body, so things might change. But most of all, focus on this part. Now let's say one of the situation where their ethics can be in question or in conflict is that, let's say I'm working for, so we can take this as an example and put this in your essay questions answer also. MCQs not necessary are easy to ask. They can give you a short case study in MCQs as well. So in 3-4 sentences also they can give you a difficult case study for this and ask you. But most of all questions are there pretty much straightforward. So essays have a much wider scope. So let's say I'm working under someone and they tell me to do a task, but I feel it is unethical. So let's say if my employer tells me copy product of another company. Now, according to me, that is unethical. But again, my employer has told me to do. So now this is the place where ethics will get challenged, or this is where you will face an issue. And many professionals have come across such a situation. So do window dressing. So even if the accountant doesn't want to do, the employer will force them. Ideally, if someone tells you to do window dressing, it is best to resign. That is the best thing, instead of joining hands with your employer. But again, so people come across such situations in their professional life, and how are you going to deal with that? That is given here in the syllabus. And also such questions can come for your essay also, that what will be your step, what you will do to come out of it. So that is where you have to stick to your IMA's ethical professional statement of ethics. So there are certain points which are given there. So whenever you're writing an answer for this particular chapter, you can try that you put down list down those points which are given in the statement. Morality and virtue. So moral principles focus on our action, and virtue is defined by our attitude and characteristics, traits. So you are stuck in a situation. So again, as I said, the same employer thing. So what I should do at this point of time? What should be my step? Ideally, I would say no, I won't copy the product. And if I'm forced to, I can choose to resign. That is what personally I would have done. But again, there is no right or wrong here. Everyone has a different perspective. Virtue, however, defines what is your attitude, what are your characteristic traits. So how are you as a person? So that is the difference. Moral philosophy, I believe Varun has explained this very much in detail. And this is the place where you can get a bit of a tricky MCQ. Because students, the problem here is students take time to remember. It's not difficult. It is just a bit tricky and requires much more reading than the other areas, because difficult to remember, difficult to recollect. The simple way to remember is just if you just go through what is written in the yellow box highlight, I think that suffices. That's sufficient. Theology. Telos is a Greek word meaning end or target. So whenever you're taking any action, what is the final target? What is the final outcome? That is what you will focus on, and accordingly you will make a decision. Accordingly you will decide what action you have to take. So here we are talking about moral philosophy. What you should do. Then moving on to deontology. Deontology is a Greek word meaning to bind or duty. So if I go according to this philosophy, it is my duty to follow the instructions of my employer. So I am going to copy the product. That is one part. Another part of this is that, will everyone or anyone in my place go for this particular choice which I am making? That my employer has told me, I will go for it. Shall I? So will anyone else act in a duty bound way or not? If others wouldn't do that, I'm taking a back. If others would, I'll go for it. virtue ethics. So here you are and everyone considers themselves as virtuous. I mean, that is very obvious. So what action would a person like you take in that situation? Would you copy the product or not copy the product? So accordingly, you will make a decision. You need not mug up the answer and write it, but let's say if you get this question only, so explain the key moral philosophies. So then you will have to mention theology, deontology, virtue ethics, utilitarianism. But the in what is written inside the explanation, you can write it in your own words. That is totally up. So next we have utilitarian ethics approach. So whatever option you go for, whether you choose to copy the product or not, if it is doing the highest good or it is giving overall happiness for most of the people, I'll go for it. So if it is going to benefit the whole society, if it is going to make everyone happy and all, then I'll go for that option. So this is another path of action which I can choose. Relativism. So here again, as I mentioned, moral values are gathered over the period of time and they change as things around us change. So for moral relativism, we have two parts: individual relativism. So people creating their own moral standards. So within, we also have our own standards, which we develop our own boundaries, our own way of behavior over the period of time, and what the society has set for. That is cultural relativism. So according to that, will my action be right or wrong? Will I copy the product or not? That is something to be decided. Then you have justice. The equitable distribution of benefit and cost is the focus of justice. The underlying moral philosophy of justice can be approached from two fundamentally different perspectives. Platonic concept of justice, individual case determined by individual rights, and Aristotelian concept of justice, comparable and consistent with results in other cases. Now, there is a very thin line between this. If I actually talk about what is the final, so if when we hear justice, we most of all think about the court. So there, I would say there is a hybrid of Platonic and Aristotelian concept. So individual case can be determined by individual rights, but also it should be consistent enough with the other results of the similar cases. Same goes with your actions. If you're stuck in a case where you need to decide that, what is the most ethical way out of the situation. Ethical decision making. So now let's say you have got an essay question where they ask you what are the basic qualities of making an ethical decision, what all things should you consider. You can list down all these points. What has to be written inside, that is your choice. Again, you can shuffle the order. So maybe you can first write integrity, then fairness, then fiduciary relationship, and then due diligence. Fairness is nothing but decision making involving ethical consequences should be a transparent process that emphasizes empathy for others and consideration for their needs and expectations. Integrity. The quality of integrity in decision making means the process is always consistent with and accountable to the individual's moral philosophy or the organization's code of ethics. Due diligence. After getting all the relevant facts and figures, important aspects of due diligence include a clear understanding of the organization's mission, value, and long term goals. Fiduciary responsibility. As key agents of the organization, finance professionals have a fiduciary responsibility to their managers and to the owners or shareholders of the company. So, this is just simple theory. You have to read it and remember the main points. That is more important. Now, we'll move on to the next subpart. I have muted the audio, so nothing to worry about it. Yeah. So now we are going to start at the next part, and very important while you write your answer. For IMA statement of ethical professional practice, before getting your CMA qualification, you need to sign the statement as well. So what are these principles? Honesty, fairness, objectivity, responsibility. Try your best to include these in your essay type question. You will fetch very good marks. But again, it should be relatable. In IMS, 4 standards of ethical conduct. Yeah. Based on the application of the 4 principles which were mentioned above, an IMA member's failure to comply with ethical standards may result in disciplinary action. Your CMA degree might be taken down, so you will not be able to associate yourself with CMA. Competence. So, what is the responsibility of each member of the CMA of the IMA? You need to maintain appropriate level of professional leadership. You need to perform your professional duties according to the the country which you are residing into. Then provide decision support, information, and recommendation which are accurate, clear, concise, and timely. Recognize and help manage risk. The next thing is you should always keep information confidential of the organization or anywhere wherever you're working. Inform all relevant parties regarding appropriate use of confidential information. And you should ensure that you're not leaking the information, not using it for any unethical or illegal advantage. Integrity. Mitigate actual conflict of interest. Regularly communicate with business associates to avoid apparent conflict of interest. Then you should refrain or abstain from engaging in anything which will not be ethical for you as well as overall for the company, and overall which will discredit your CMA profession. Contribute to a positive ethical culture and place integrity of the profession above personal interest. Credibility. Communicate information fairly and objectively. Provide all relevant information that would reasonably be expected to influence an intended user's understanding of the reports, analysis, or recommendation. You should also report any delay or deficiency in information and communicate professional limitations. In order to be credible, an individual must be competent. So whatever information you're providing, whatever reports you're giving, it should be credible enough. And for that to be credible, you as an individual need to be competent. Now we something have called as fraud risk. So all this, why you need to be ethical and everything, it boils down to fraud risk. Now unintentional, then it is an error. If it is intentional, it is fraud. So here we have wonderful examples given. First is, you can manipulate all your records, or, and the records need not always be of financial elements. It can be any non-financial report also. You can altogether make a transaction and not record it in the books. Then you can misapply, or you can say modify it in such a way that people are not able to catch you for the accounting principles. Then cooking the books, which Enron had done. Misappropriation of assets. So you can embezzle the cash which is there, so you can take cash and replace it back after 2-3 days. And the cycle keeps on going unless and until someday someone catches you by reconciliation. Stealing or theft. Illegal acts, violation of law or governmental regulation committed by the entity or by company personnel acting on behalf of the entity. Fraud risk factors. Conditions generally present in all individuals who commit fraud. So this is, we call it as a fraud triangle. So the person has an opportunity to commit a fraud. If they are going to get an incentive by committing that act, or they are under deep pressure from the employer or their family, and if they are able to rationalize it, yes, I'm doing this fraud because of this, so it is totally fine. So this rationalization mindset or attitude comes if these all three elements are there together. There's a very high fraud risk. Conducting an organizational fraud risk assessment can assist with managing the risk of fraud, such as assessments involves identifying and evaluating fraud risk factor, identifying possible fraud risk schemes and scenarios. prioritizing unidentified fraud risk and assessing their likelihood, evaluating internal controls to mitigate fraudulent activity, documenting and continually monitoring and updating the fraud risk assessment. Now the homework which I will give to all of you, so yet we are going to do the another part also. Now the ethics scenarios which are given to you in this chapter in ebook itself. Take 30 minutes and try to answer each one of them. So take 10 minutes to read it, even if it is a big question, take 10 minutes to read, and later take 30 minutes to answer all the 6 questions and see how your answers are. Again, they need not be the same because ethics is again a very subjective thing. So, yeah, sorry. So what I'm saying is your answers might be totally different from what is given in the book, but that's totally fine as far as it's about the chapter of ethics. So let's move on to the next part now. Let me share my screen. Yeah. Ethical considerations for the organization. Ethics is about the integrity of the decision-making process, which is used to resolve any number of issues. According to Statement on Management Accounting, values and ethics form inception to practice. Important. Corporate responsibility for ethical conduct. Identifying and documenting organizational values. See, ethics policy is there with every company. Whichever organization you join, mid-size, big size, everyone will have the ethics policy and a code of conduct. They will expect you to behave in a certain way, execute tasks in a certain way. Again, you can choose to make a statement, your policy based on statement of IMA or whatever ethics codes they have, or you can create your own. The class will end as soon as I'm done with this part. So as I had already mentioned that you don't have a class on Thursday. So today's class will get extended. I think this is 3 times in the class which I've announced now since 7:30. Companies that take corporate ethical responsibility seriously and demonstrate a strong ethical culture may see the benefits in improved share value, increased client retention, enhanced attraction of new clients, investors, and employees, higher level of productivity, improved interpersonal dynamics, reduced risk of compliance violations, and reduced risk of fraud. I would say whatever is given, as a direct extract from IMA's statements or any document of IMA, read it as it is. Again, you need not mug up. Ethics starts at the top. See, I might come with the best ethical policy, but if my senior, if the management is not ethical, then overall the environment of the organization is going to crash down and people are not going to follow the policies. See, auditors can fix the loophole, okay, but technical ones. If all the employees are unethical itself, then no matter how strong internal controls you put or fraud prevention mechanisms you put in place, they are going to fail. Auditor then will detect the fraud which people have carried on, but prevention happens in technical areas, and maybe they can, advise the company to carry on ethics training and everything. But again, it depends on the individual how much they want to grasp and form. So everything has its own limitations. So that's why we say risk can be minimized, but risk can never be eliminated. So let's say there's a company and the senior management which is there, they are, taking bribe and not, just a moment. Yeah. So I was saying that let's say that there's a company, and the senior management is taking bribes, giving bribes and doing all their work. Then if there's a very good and, ethical employee, a very honest employee who has joined the company, they will get demotivated over the period of time and they'll leave the company. But if the senior management is very much ethical and strict in their practices, then ultimately every employee will have to follow. top. Now, applying ethics in the corporate setting. Yes, tone at the top. Now, applying ethics in the corporate setting. So, your senior management is very important, but overall, your employees, whom you hire, that also you should look upon. That is why we do something called as background verification. So, you should hire the right candidates. You should train them. So, there is ethics training, which especially in corporates, every year, ethics training is being conducted for all the employees, even for the sales team, even for the back office, everyone. Ethics training is a mandate. Then leadership. Your leadership itself should be very important. Again, here the tone at the top principle comes into picture. If your leader is itself not ethical, then you might be ethical, but you will be demotivated. You will not, so you will feel that, despite being so ethical, despite carrying on my work diligently, I'm not being rewarded or not recognized, or, because someone who is not following ethical practices is not going to recognize the person or his efforts who is actually being true to his work. That is a simple psychology. Then measuring and improving ethical compliance. So here we have something called as human performance feedback loop, survey tools, and whistleblowing framework. These 3 points for essay very important, this particular part. So human performance feedback loop. So here what we do is that we take an idea, we take a survey from inside in our company only, we take a questionnaire and we identify how people are performing, what is the employer's feedback, what is the employee's feedback, and what all things they can do. See, as a senior management, just observing from the top, you may not get a full idea. But when you take a questionnaire and so among the employees, there are a lot of things which you can come to know. So employees are gossiping about a particular thing, or anything like that. So that is an alarm. From there, the senior management can come to know that something is going wrong in this particular department. Survey tool. So you can take an overall survey from the company. So you can, tell your employees to rate that, how much ethical do you think a company is? How well are you happy with the practices? So overall, that percentile or rating which is there, it tells a lot. Whistleblowing framework. So if you feel that, something is happening wrong in the company and you want to report it, every company, even small size, has a whistleblowing framework. You can go according to that framework. If you feel your immediate senior only is a part of that fraud, you can report to his senior. Or if in India it is a rule that if everyone is involved in it, you find a fraud, you need to report it to Ministry of Corporate Affairs. So reporting is required, and if it's an immediate senior, please also let it know to their senior. If your entire senior management, let's say your directors and everyone is involved, you know whom to connect with. And also you can take opinion from your lawyer and you can choose to resign as well. So we have a whistleblowing hotline which is there. So from that you can report the particular fraud. So you can be anonymous also, so that protects the identity of the person who has raised the concern. And it also so there's no harm for anyone to report any fraud, so that is ensured. Whistleblowing is that there's a chance that an MCQ might come on that. See, are you at fault if you don't report the fraud? Now this question, it is subjective, but I would say, if you ask from my perspective, then yes, I would say you're pretty much at fault. See, if let's say your company is doing window dressing, you are given option by the government to report by being anonymous. Go and report. Because see, there's a saying that the one who does a mistake is definitely the one who has done the crime, but one who keeps quiet while looking at that mistake is also equally responsible. Now, this is a virtue or a moral thing which I follow, but yes, like I would say that you will be at fault if you don't report, if something is going really wrong and you're just keeping mute. But again, as ethics is a subjective thing, so something might, in your eyes, be right or wrong. FCPA is another important thing which can come for your exam. So what does FCPA say is that it prohibits the US public companies from, paying bribes to foreign government in order to obtain a contract. So let's say if US government is, planning to get into a construction contract again and entering into construction line in another company, in another country. So the US government officials are prohibited from giving any bribe to the foreign country government officials for getting the contract. So again, for contract, many of them, there's a tender which is passed and one of them is selected and so on. So bribe is not allowed. And one should also know what is the difference between commission and bribe. So let's say if the general commission taken for a particular project is 10%, and if the person is demanding 15 or even 11%, you should know that only 10% is the real commission and that 1% is a bribe. So you should not pay that 1%. There's a thin line between things and it is up to the management to decide. SOX compliance, you can read it twice for your MCQs. I mean, I'm not saying ignore it, but again, don't mug it up. Just simply read it. Simply read. To embargo or not to embargo. So what happens is most of the organizations, if there's a country where there are a lot of unethical practices going on, they don't put on their subsidiary. Sarbanes-Oxley, that is SOX. So there are companies who normally won't like to invest or keep their projects or plants in a country where there are a lot of unethical practices going on. But unethical practices generally goes on in a country which is not much developed. So there are a few companies who might think that, no, let us have our plant here so that we can also contribute to the development of the society in that country. So we can bring a change. So again, that is a decision which MNCs can take according to their choice. Means either you're going to keep your functions of your company in that country or to not. So either you're going to restrict or not restrict. They have even given an example. The US, for example, for many years enforced an embargo on trade with or investment in South Africa because the country's discriminatory practice of apprehended. So they have restricted, they have enforced no, we will not trade with this country or we will not carry on any operations in this country. For Sarbanes-Oxley, again, you can simply remember it. Now, this is they have given one entire section in detail, but there are also areas where they have given you the entire section in just one sentence. So in such cases, just read it once or twice, and I think that's sufficient. So here again, it depends. So when I talk about the waiver and implicit waiver, if there's so SEC has defined the term waiver as company approval for an officer to make a material departure from code of ethics. And second thing is if there's a material departure and people know but still haven't reported, then that is called implicit waiver, implied waiver. SEC recognizes that a code of ethics need to be applicable to the specific situation and culture of the company. Therefore, it declined to offer any specific wrongdoing or provisions that should be included in the code of ethics. However, SEC did add that a code of ethics should also promote prompt reporting of violations of the code of ethics as well as accountability for adhering to the code. This is the ethics scenario for you to practice. Sustainability and social responsibility. So we have our Carroll's CSR pyramid. First comes your ethics, economic responsibility. So you should be able to earn enough profits. You should be so basic, your money. You should have money. Other than that, how will you contribute to the society, right? You should first have something in your own basket to help others. So that is your economic responsibility. Whenever you have any business, you should be, the basic thing is, are you earning profits or not? Then are you complying with the laws or not? Are you being ethical or not? And then how much and how well are you contributing to the society or people around you, philanthropic responsibility. So that is the Carroll's CSR pyramid. Economic responsibility, what does it say? That you have a responsibility towards your own self and to the employees in your company also, right? If you're not earning profits, how are you going to pay them? So when you say which of these responsibilities are conflicting, nothing is conflicting. Everything should be there. This is a mix. There's a package, so there's nothing conflict. They have given an example of what is each of these. So they have given an explanation. Again, you can write it in your own words, but ensure that in this part, you need to follow it line wise only. So first you should write economic only, then legal, then ethical, and then philanthropic. You can't change the order because it's first year, second year, third year, and fourth year. This is business sustainability, triple bottom line. Sustainability is a process by which companies manage their financial, social, and environmental risk. These three impacts are sometimes referred to as profit, social, so that is financial, people, social, and planet environment. And if you merge each of these, if every of these things are there, you call it as sustainable. No, see, when I say fulfill economic responsibility, you have to ensure that you're also being ethical and legal. So when I say fulfill your economic responsibility first, that doesn't mean that you're going to, like get into any illegal business and first earn the profit and then move on to, no, that is not the meaning of it. It means that your focus should be on profit, but also ensure that you're not, it should not be that you're not complying with any legal or ethical responsibility or, the policies which are there. So business sustainability represents resiliency over time. So what does resiliency mean? Resiliency means that, if there are many business shocks or any moments which may or may not be in your favor, how well I established a strong your company is to face it or to sustain it. And how will you come to know that? If you have all these factors in place, perfectly well balanced, managed, then yes, your organization can develop resiliency over a period of time. The threefold approach to business provides a framework for organizations to manage themselves ethically, no matter where in the world they might operate. So this was about your triple bottom line. And by this, we end our professional ethics part also. So for those who are now appearing for your part 2 exam, wish you all the very best for your exam. And I hope you all do it great. So I believe that in January you all will be appearing, and a few might be, again taking a part 1, which is going to start now in the next few weeks and then appearing in January. So all the best. Keep practicing. If you are already done with entire part 2 studies, I suggest that take mock test and see how much well prepared you are, and then start with your part 1. Thank you so much, everyone, and wish you all a very happy Diwali.